Okay, well that's our official starting time, and we have a lot of folks here, and we want to try to end on time, so let's get going. First of all, it's fabulous to have so many people here. 140 participants is terrific. I'm Jenny Bradbury with PBS Teachers, and it's a huge pleasure tonight to have as my fellow moderator Steve Hargadon from Classroom 2.0 for an interview with John Palfrey, the author of Born Digital. John is the Henry N. S. Professor of Law and Vice Dean for Library and Information Resources at Harvard Law School, and in addition to co-authoring Born Digital, he also co-authored Access Denied, the Practice and Politics of Internet Filtering. His research and teaching is focused on internet law, intellectual property, and international law. He's a faculty co-director of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and he's also the proud parent of 2 digital natives, which I would guess we'll be hearing about later on tonight. So welcome, John. Thank you so much for being here. Before we get
Thanks so much for having me.
So before we get into the bulk of the interview, I'm going to turn it over to Steve, who's our Illuminate wizard, to give you all an orientation to the environment, show you how to use some of the tools, and set up your audio wizard. And then we're going to do the poll we've been talking about to find out where everyone is here from tonight. So Steve, take it away.
Thanks, Jenny. Welcome, everyone. This is really fun. We love doing this, and we love this environment. The first recommendation that I would make is that you go up to the icons at the top of your screen, and the third icon in is a select window layout. And with this many people, the chat will seem to fly by very fast. So if you click on the down arrow there, you can select the wide layout, and it's a little bit easier to see who's online and what's going on in the chat room. The chat is really fun. It's a great opportunity to put in links and make connections while you're listening, kind of taking notes for everyone else. It does help with this many people if you can kind of stay on topic, because we are going to ask you for questions in the chat area, and so if those get buried beneath all kinds of other stuff, it may be hard for us to find. If you ask a question and we don't get to it and you think that we should have, please repost it. It may just be that it slipped by and was too fast for us. I want to tell you about some of the actual icons that you see on your screen that will make a difference for you. You do have a participants window. You can see who else is here. You have this chat window as well. And you can chat with the group as a whole by posting a message down at the bottom and sending to this room. And you can chat directly to anybody else who's in the room. Do know that those of us who are moderators see all the chats, so it's not fully private when you chat with someone else. There are some fun icons at the bottom of the participant window. I'm going to click on the clapping hand. That's a way of showing approval, expressing our appreciation. Let's all clap for John, that he's here. Thank you for being here, John. You can also click on the smiley face. A number of you have clicked on the hand with the up arrow, which is actually different than the clapping hand. That's indicating that you want to raise your hand. We're not going to use that a lot tonight, but we know what you've done, and it's not a big deal. I'm going to clear all of those. And there is a hand with little red lines. That's the applause hand, and that's different than the one with the green arrow up. You can express confusion as well. Thumbs down. I know we won't have any thumbs down tonight, but those emoticons are there for you to use to kind of participate in the experience by indicating your support or interest in something that is said. We are sure glad to have you here tonight. Sure hope that you are enjoying this environment. And I'm going to pass it back to you, Jenny. Or why don't I ask about locations? Are we ready for that?
Yeah, I think that's great.
Okay, so this is a map of the United States. Don't worry, the world map will come up next. But on your whiteboard, you will notice that there is a little wand next to the map with a red dot at the end. And if you click on that wand with the red dot, you can place it where you are located. So if you're in the continental United States, you can put a dot on the map to let us know where you are. Look at that, how much fun. Pretty good coverage. Okay, I'm now going to switch to the world map. And if you would do the same thing here, you click on the little wand with the red dot next to the map, and then place yourself on this world map. UK, Hawaii, Southeast Asia.
One in China?
Yeah, one in China. Terrific. Now, it's just fun, just for fun. You don't have to do this, but if you'll put in where you're from and what the temperature and the weather is, it's often fun for people to find out what the circumstances are like around the world as people are listening. And I am going to move this forward. And Jenny, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thanks, Steve. So just to give you a sense of what we're going to do tonight, we're basically going to take the bulk of the hour to talk with John, and we're going to have opportunities for Q&A throughout the presentation. So those of you who hear something interesting that you want to respond to, please go ahead and put your question in the chat window. Steve and I will be taking turns collecting those questions and putting them into a Google Doc for John so that he is seeing those questions and will have a chance to address as many of them as possible during the hour. Then before we wrap up for the hour, we're going to show you a little bit more about PBS Teachers. We're going to show you about our upcoming webinars. Steve has a very interesting webinar coming up as well. And then at the very end, we'll have a survey so that we can get feedback from you about what worked and what didn't work tonight so that we can continue to improve these events. So that's what we have on the agenda. I'm going to start right now by asking John to give us sort of a brief overview of the book and explain to us in a nutshell what the book's about and why you decided to write it.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you for everyone spending time this evening or whatever time it is on your time being with us. The reason we wrote this book, and I have a co-author named Urs Gasser, who was a professor at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, really was to try to take the best research about how kids are using new technologies and to try to bring that to bear on how we take advantage of the great opportunities associated with it and how we address the biggest challenges associated with it. And the key really was to write a book for parents and teachers. So this is why I'm particularly excited to be part of this PBS Teachers program. The core of what we were trying to do was to examine really the myths that people have about this group of young people and try to debunk those myths where it made sense to do that, and then to reinforce things where it happens to be true based on the research that we did.
Great, thanks. And since we'll be spending actually most of the hour looking at those myths in more detail, but before we go to that, could you tell us a little bit about your methodology? Who did you interview? Did you talk to teachers? Did you talk to digital natives? Where were they? How many of them were there? Those sorts of things.
Absolutely. So we did two things by way of research. We did what any self-respecting scholar would, which is to look at what everybody else did and try to make sure that we were not overlooking any of the key data from quantitative or qualitative studies. So we spent a lot of time reading about things like what our colleague Dana Boyd has done, Esther Hargitay from Northwestern, all the wonderful reports that have been done by the Pew Internet and American Life group. There are lots of equivalents of these studies around the world, as you know as well. So we looked at what, for instance, our friends at Oxford had done in the UK through the OXIS survey and similar methodology. So we did the most comprehensive literature review we could. And then we did our own research based on some questions that we had most on our top of mind. And in essence, we did focus groups and interviews. That was our modes. It was qualitative in nature. I'm not a social scientist, so we hired some PhDs who worked with us and came up with a responsible methodology and had a survey at the front end, and then lots of in-depth questions in focus groups. And then we would often go back to individual students we met in the focus groups for longer interviews to try to drill down on further issues. In the course of our structured interviews, we did a lot in the Northeast of the United States. We did a bunch in Europe because I had a co-author, Urs Gasser, who was based in Switzerland. We did a bunch in the Gulf, based in Bahrain, but which was from people all over the Gulf. And then in East Asia, so we talked to people in Shanghai and Beijing and China, went to North Korea, and there's a professor in Japan, in fact, who did a similar kind of parallel survey with ours. So our own sample size was not huge. We were trying to really fill in some gaps in the research that we had seen that others had done, but of course we're building on the shoulders of giants, as you always are as a researcher.
Right. Well, I'm sure it was fascinating to talk to all those different populations, and hopefully maybe later on tonight we can get into a little bit about whether there are differences between them all. But moving forward, I'm going to now ask, because we're going to be spending the bulk of the evening talking about digital natives, try to get a sense from our participants here about how sort of comfortable this group is with digital technologies. So the first question, we're going to ask these in order, and if you could just use the green check mark to answer yes and the red X to answer no, this will be an informal, quick poll to get a sense of how native some of our participants are. So the first question is, do you write and post original text online using a blog, wiki, Twitter, or other publishing tool?
Jenny, do you want me to show the results when we're done with each question?
Sure, that'd be great. So it looks like we have quite a few.
You call the time and I'll show the results.
Okay. All right, let's do the results on this one. Okay, so then let's move on to the next one down. Folks out there, do you create and post images, video, audio, and other forms of multimedia online? All right, Steve, you want to share the results on this one? It's interesting. So even more people are posting multimedia than writing. Okay, so then the next question, do you belong to a social network?
So the check marks are the green check mark at the top of the screen and the red X at the top of the screen.
Great, so let's see the results on that one. Okay, so just over half. The next question, do you participate in virtual worlds, like Second Life or something of that sort? Interesting, so many fewer people doing the virtual worlds. Okay, how about online games? Okay, great. And then last, have you searched for yourself on Google, People, or some other search engine? Wow, so that one's quite high as well. Okay, great. Well, that was really interesting. Thanks for participating in that. I'm going to turn it over to Steve now to talk with John a little bit about digital natives, how they're defined, how maybe they compare to our audience group here, and then to look at myth one, which is that digital natives are a generation. So Steve, take it away.
So John, does that poll give us a little bit of a segue here for talking about this distinction between a generation and a population? And if so, would you kind of help us to understand why this distinction is important?
Sure, of course, and the poll is illuminating as always, no pun intended. The one thing that we wanted to be very clear about as we went through this research was to examine whether it's true that young people all use technology in advanced ways and older people don't, which seems to me, of course, unlikely to be true, and it turns out not to be. What we wanted to do in the sort of at the outset was to take this term digital natives, which is uncomfortable for some people for a variety of reasons, and to try to reclaim it in a way. So we tried to figure out what's a good definition for somebody who truly was born digital. And we use three attributes as at the end of the day. One is that born after 1980. The reason for this distinction really was that it was after the advent of social technologies, so bulletin board systems and so forth, so they didn't know a world before that. Secondly, that they have access to the technology. So we bear in mind there are about 1 billion out of 6.6 billion people on the planet who have access to the technologies. That's crucial. And then last, that they have skills to use those technologies. And I think this is, in a way, the punchline of a lot of the research in this area, which is there are, especially in rich countries like the United States, virtually everyone has access to either a cell phone or they could get online at a library or at a school. There's not that much of a digital divide in terms of accessing the technology in some fashion. Where we do see a big distinction is that there are some kids who are much less skilled than other kids at using it. And my colleague Esther Hargitay has done a fair amount of study on this, and her data and others show that it breaks down on socioeconomic lines by and large, that especially if your parents have higher rates of education, you're much more likely to have more sophisticated skills in using these technologies. And I think that's a very important factor. So we really said at the end of the day, it's not a generation but a population of young people who use technology in these distinctive ways. And we also highlight the fact that there are many people on Illuminate right now, of the 150 or so teachers in this session, who use technologies in just as sophisticated ways as many of the young people do. So it's not that there aren't older people who are in fact doing very exciting things using technology in the ways that young people are as well.
John, is one of the danger for educators that if we think of the term digital natives as being more accurate maybe than it is, that we are not looking at specific needs of students who wouldn't qualify necessarily, although they were born after 1980?
Sure, I think that's right. So, I mean, any of these distinctions are fairly arbitrary, but I think our goal here was to try to determine a class of people that we could talk about in distinctive ways. But I think again there are people who are on the other side of the participation gap who are born much later, and I think who will use technology in different ways. And again, there are many of us who were there when the online social world emerged, who are digital settlers and who again may use the technology in just as sophisticated ways as younger people.
So that was the first myth that we wanted to focus on. Are there any questions from the audience about this particular principle? Jenny, did you see any, or shall we move on?
Well, I just saw some interesting comments in the chat about it really being a state of mind as opposed to an age distinction or something like that. And I think that speaks to the fact that a lot of our participants tonight are a lot more native, or at least a lot more comfortable with these technologies than they're sometimes given credit for, as John said. So let's go ahead and look at the second myth, which I think is one that we'll have a lot to talk about. And this myth is that digital natives are more endangered. This is obviously a very pervasive myth. You hear a lot about cyber predators and kids being exposed to inappropriate content, and certainly a lot of school districts have imposed policies that are designed to protect kids at all costs, which often means limiting access to some really exciting technology tools. So, John, if you could start us off by telling us what you found in regard to this myth. Is it truly a myth? Are parts of it true and parts of it not?
I think, as with most things, parts of it are true and parts of it are not. And as you teed it up, there's no doubt that there are safety issues associated with kids going online, and there's no doubt there's a lot of work for parents and teachers and mentors and kids themselves to do to keep kids safer. Separate from the book, or after the book actually, I spent the last year chairing the Internet Safety Technical Task Force, which was a year-long effort. It was 29 companies and child safety advocates and others, including MySpace and Facebook and Google and National Coalition for Missing Exploited Children and so forth, working to identify what the real risks are facing kids and to identify whether technologies in particular could help this. And part of that was a very, very extensive review of the literature of the real risks that kids face. And the thing that we had been asked to look at, particularly by the 49 attorneys general who set up this task force, was whether or not sexual predation was something that we could help address through technologies. Second of all, access to unwanted pornography in particular, is that something we could sort through technologies and so forth. It turns out that it is the case that young people can meet somebody online in a social network or otherwise and have that person then lure them into the offline world and do something terrible to them as an awful, awful crime and a parent's worst nightmare. Turns out that, though, that it's not worse off than we were before the Internet came on the scene. So this, I think, is one of the myths that we need to look at more carefully, which says if you track, for instance, from 1990 to today, the likelihood overall that a young person would in fact be a victim of sexual predation is going down, not up. And the distinction here is that obviously some of the times when the young person meets the person who's going to do them harm, the place they meet is online. So the public park has gone from real space and to, in some cases, online spaces, including social networks. Turns out instant messaging and chat environments are much more likely environments for people to meet sexual predators. It's also much more likely the case that kids who are at risk in the offline world are going to be harmed in this particular way. So the predator, stranger danger risk is real, of course, and terrifying. But it's not the case that the Internet has made this dramatically worse. Second thing that we looked at was access to inappropriate content. So one of the concerns over the Internet, of course, has been, are kids accessing more pornography, more hate speech, and so forth. I think the key here is that there's the ability to access this, clearly much easier. You can go and do a Google search on any remotely naughty term and come up on any device with lots of pornography, that there is greater access. It doesn't turn out to be the case, though, that wildly more young people are being faced with harmful content than in the past. And, of course, in many cases, young people are seeking to access it, particularly older males. So on the content one, yes, there's work to be done, and certainly filters on home computers and so forth are good ways for parents to limit what their kids get to. There's lots and lots of debate as to whether or not filtering makes sense in schools. I have strong feelings on that as well, especially since kids can get around them so easily. But again, I wouldn't put this in the crisis proportion zone. The thing that really popped out of the research that was not really what the attorneys general wanted us to focus on, but which was so clear from the data, is that the incidence of bullying is much greater. So the likelihood that a young person will encounter psychological harm done by peers online is going up in almost every study we looked at. So where the incidence of an adult doing sexual harm based on age deception and so forth is not skyrocketing, which is good news, the likelihood that something psychologically harming of a young person by another young person is on the increase. So I think this question of how we address bullying in online spaces is an important one.
Great. So, I mean, I think, one of the things that I really like about the book is that the chapters are broken down very simply, and so you have a chapter on privacy, a chapter on safety, a chapter on aggressors, which all, I think, sort of feed into the myth. One of the things that you talk about is sort of the dangers that are faced by digital natives because of copyright laws, and part of that's their lack of understanding. Part of that is having a different relationship to content. And so my question, I guess, is since much of education around these issues today seems to focus on helping students and teachers understand the existing regulations, but in the book you seem to actually advocate for changing those regulations. I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit and speak to sort of what educators can do to be part of that conversation.
Sure. So, I think it's important to acknowledge the extent to which the law is what it is, and we should encourage our kids to, in fact, be compliant with it. And then secondly, we should say, okay, but do we want to adjust the law? Because there are good reasons to do that as a normative matter. So starting with the first one, this is one of the myths that we couldn't debunk. In essence, young people tend to rip off the music that they get on the internet and not to pay for it. This is clearly something that the recording industry knows for some time, and that Hollywood and the newspapers and others are sort of coming to grips with now. So there's no doubt but that young people are, in many cases, getting music inappropriately and not paying for it. There's another piece of this, which is, though, the young people have a lot of confusion around the question of what they can do with copyrighted material. This is something I'm sure many teachers experience all the time, which is kids are great at creating digital media, remixing, creating profiles, using copyrighted work in lots of different ways, and where I think there are real advantages and opportunities here for education. But the copyright law mystifies them, and they confuse copyright and plagiarism. They have very little sense of the notion of fair use, which is one of the excuses for the possible infringement. And this is an area also where I know teachers are often confused and parents. So it's clear to me that this is an area where we need to focus on, can we educate both kids and teachers about the law. I think 200 years ago, you think about it, copyright law didn't apply to most people. It applied to people who made maps and charts and books and so forth. Today, copyright law applies to every kid and in every classroom. So I think it's quite important that we think about education and copyright. And of course, it's in some of the federal standards as things that schools need to do. In terms of copyright reform, I'm a believer that the copyright law is somewhat out of whack, that it's not that kids should be ripping off music, they shouldn't, and violating the law consistently, but neither do I think we should have a complicated and outdated copyright system that makes criminals of our kids. And I think it's a longer discussion of how the legal reform ought to happen, but I think it's a very important public policy issue.
Agreed. I see a lot of comments in the chat space about copyright and plagiarism. Does anyone have a specific question that they'd like to ask John on this issue of safety, online safety and endangerment of digital natives?
Jenny, I wish Brittany, I could say that I'd called some good questions out from the chat, but they're going by so fast.
I know, they're going really fast. But I see that Brittany has one. So Brittany, why don't you type it into the chat window, please?
And while Brittany's typing, a couple of people said they're having trouble making sending a chat to the whole room. That probably means that you don't have this room selected next to your send button. Click the down arrow and just make sure you select this room, and it will go to everyone in this room if you're not sending it directly to the whole group.
So Brittany's question is, do you see that, John?
I do. So Brittany, you ask thoughts about how to get students to experience remixing in the classroom. I think it's a great question. In fact, I think it goes to, in a way, how we can help teach them about copyright. I have seen in a number of instances that teachers have created projects where kids remix some materials in the classroom, and it could be very simple. You could give them a few bits of digital media that they put together, so you could have a movie sequence plus an audio sequence that somebody else has licensed. Creative Commons licensing, if you don't know it, is something started at my home institution at the Berkman Center. It's spun out as a worldwide nonprofit, and they've got a bunch of licenses, and you can search for appropriately licensed material. and have kids do remixes as an assignment. And one of the things we found was if you put kids in the position of being the creators, they, in fact, act really differently. I think it's an amazing experience to watch kids with this, where if they are the ones who are creating something, then they often think very differently about the rights associated with it. They think about the extent to which they could choose once they get these materials. Let's say they create it entirely on their own, whether they want to become rich and sell it to other people, so they would license it under full copyright, or they want to become famous. They want lots of people to see it, and they don't care if they get paid for it, which might be an argument for having the Creative Commons licensing on it. You also get the sense that they think about the inbound rights. They think about other artists who have contributed to what they're making. So I'm a huge believer in having them do some remix, whether it's in an ordinary classroom experience or in a class on art or music, and then having them think about copyright as part of it. I think it's a great entree to it. One of the other questions that went by was about the Gray album and the dispute really about when you create something that is a sort of a close knockoff of copyrighted works, and it becomes itself kind of a cultural product ultimately. There are a lot of instances like this where it's not permitted under the copyright law, and when you push it to a court where the court would say, this was a copyright infringement, and yet, on the other hand, it's actually a form of activism. It's a form of democratic participation to be doing this, and it's meant to be a statement. I think this is a really good way to teach the topic of civil disobedience as well, where I think there is a big distinction between somebody who simply steals music off of LimeWire and somebody who does a remix that itself might be copyright violating on its face, but might be done for teaching or learning purposes. So it's not to condone any kind of activity, but I do think it's an interesting problem to teach.
Yeah, I agree, and I really second your feeling that getting kids involved in creation is critical. I'm actually posting in the chat window right now a link that I came across this last week. It's a site that Microsoft created, and it's basically designed to do just that, to give kids a chance to try out making media and then have to make decisions about what types of licenses and rights they want to associate with it. It really puts them in the driver's seat as creators and gives them a sense from that perspective of these issues. So, Steve, do you want to move on to myth 3?
Yes, and while I'm going to give John a compliment. I'm having trouble, I'm not even speaking, and I'm having trouble responding to people in the chat room. And there's John doing all this talking and then replying to someone in the chat. So, John, you're a good multitasker.
Thank you.
I speak to a lot of educators who are really worried that our youth are going to be significantly less informed, and that they're missing something critical by not using the traditional media that we have. And somebody actually sent me an article today, and the quote was, "Social networking sites are doing irrevocable damage to the brains of child users," a top neuroscientist claims. She says that social networking is leading to shortened attention spans and self-centered children. How would you respond to this?
So there is absolutely a cultural war that's emerging around this question. Around the time that we put out this book, Born Digital, there was another book called The Dumbest Generation that a professor, I think from Emory, Mark Bauerlein, wrote. And, the premises of the two books really couldn't be all that much different. I think from my perspective, a lot of what's going on is that kids are learning in different ways. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but we need to figure out how to take advantage of the great and to curb the worst excesses on the other side of it. My sense is that there are real challenges for our students in how they are sort of interacting with the information environment. So one example that I give from the research, we asked all kids if they were doing a research project, say on a topic like the Spanish-American War. That was an example we used. Lou Gehrig's disease was another one. We said, so how would you go about researching that and turning in a paper. And the kids we were talking to were aged 13 to 22, but imagine the high school student just for simplicity. Kids would say consistently that not that they'd go to the library, that they would go to a computer, whether it was their laptop or one in the school, and they would go to open a browser and they would go to Google, and it was always Google, no matter where we were, and they would type in Spanish-American War, Spanish-American War, or Lou Gehrig's disease, and they would then see the results that would come up, and they would invariably click on the Wikipedia entry for Spanish-American War. And it was only at that point that we would see the variation in terms of what they did. So the least sophisticated kids would cut and paste the Wikipedia entry into their report and consider themselves done. They obviously didn't get all that much in the way of good grades, but it was efficient. On the other end of the spectrum, there were those kids who wouldn't take anything out of the Wikipedia entry. They would say, I'm really worried that my classmate was just there 2 minutes ago and introduced a false fact into it, so I don't believe it at all. And I think there's a fair amount that lies in between those, and the extent to which we can teach kids about what Wikipedia, just as one example, has to offer in terms of a history of who wrote what, about the discussion pages in certain instances, and also the fact that on some topics Wikipedia is just terrible. But the act of then thinking through this is one source and there are many other sources, and how we kind of triangulate between them, that seems to me a crucial piece of what we teach. So giving them a way to make sense of these new contexts, pick up on different clues, learn basic digital media skills, I think these are crucial things, and ones that we don't do as well as we should right now in education. One just sort of side note, when I asked all these questions of kids, I would occasionally say, so did you ever think to go to a library? One kid to us, he said to us, no, and then he said, wait, I did. I once went to a library on a field trip. So some extent to which the library is, for some kids, sort of like a museum. The number of other kids relative to the library would say we would go to the library if we were assigned to quote a book or cite a book. So if teachers said you had to go have a book, they would go and pick it out. In my own experience at Harvard Law School, which is obviously older kids and certainly sophisticated students, our library is packed. The library is every seat taken, so much so that we in fact have to keep some kids from other parts of campus out of the library during exam times. They're not pulling books off the shelves, but they are in there and learning, and it's just in different ways. One final note on it, there's a very active discussion among neuroscientists about whether or not brains are in fact being rewired. There's a book called iBrain, which is out there making one argument that yes, there's some rewiring going on in terms of how kids learn. My instinct is it is so different in terms of how kids are processing information that something must be going on in that way, but I'm no neuroscientist.
John, I loved the process, the multi-step process you described of grazing, deep dive, and feedback loop, because I think I recognized my own practice there. Would you go on to take a minute and just describe that?
Sure. I think one of the other things in this context of how kids get information that's different is, think about getting news and information over the course of the day. Kids do not wake up in the morning and read the New York Times cover to cover with a cup of coffee next to them, or the Washington Post, or wherever you are, the daily paper, nor at the end of the day do they tend to sit in front of Walter Cronkite or now Katie Couric telling the world what happened in terms of news. It's much more a process that happens over the course of the day and in ways that are kind of much less structured. So our assessment of how many of the kids we were talking to got information was a three-step process that Steve just referred to. The first step is really grazing, the notion of seeing lots and lots of headlines over the course of a day. It might be, in Twitter, seeing a bunch of headlines go by, or a My Yahoo page, or in Facebook, the news feeds. It might be the headlines going along the bottom of CNN, or seeing a newsstand on the way to school. And that's how most of the information gets to them, that they see these very short sound bites in headline form. For a subset of students, they will seek more information on that topic, and so they take step 2, which we call deep dive, the notion of saying, I would really like to learn more about this topic. It may be a serious topic, it may be about Britney Spears, it may be something in between, but they seek to, in essence, to click on the hypertext link, that they go beyond the headline to get the analysis or a blog post or commentary or something. And then the third step is what we call a feedback loop. This is the fewest students out of any is saying I want to speak back to this. I want to talk back, and I want to have some extent to which I can participate in this dialogue. And that might be posting it back on your Facebook page. It might be putting it on your MySpace page. It might be tweeting it. It might be putting it on a blog. So this is quite a different way, of course, of interacting with news and information than what a generation ago kids were doing. I suspect that this will change yet again, but it's very much what the news industry is trying to figure out how they get in step with. I should just add one tiny note. Sometimes the headlines are the equivalent of those free newspapers, Metro, it's called in Boston, I think lots of other places. These are incredibly popular among young people, so it's not always in digital format. It's it's sometimes in hard copy, but also in these very short formats.
Would it be fair to say that we might take away this, or that educators might take away from this, the importance of teaching the deep dive and the feedback loop?
So that's a really, really good question. And I defer to kind of real educators on this topic. My sense is that with each of these things, we should lean into it to the extent that we know that they're doing it and see what we think. Maybe try it out ourselves and see if that in fact describes a good way to learn. And where it's not, that we should try to teach them something else as a different way to go. So in the context of law school, which is the one I know best as a teacher, I'm also director of the Harvard Law Library. One of the things that we worry about a fair amount is kids are thinking about legal research as just the equivalent of a Google search. So you're just typing in a few words that might bring up a law or a case or commentary on it, which actually isn't a particularly good way to do legal research. So in those cases where it's something that we know is probably not a good way to do the research, where we have to give them a little more structure, we need to push back on it. And in other cases, if it's something that we can run with and structure in a way that's going to be useful, I'm kind of all for learning and seeing if that can work. But it's a great question. I don't have my mind made up about it yet. The one thing that I think is crucial about how we teach in these environments, though, is that we really step back and say, is the technology helping our pedagogical goals or helping us meet our pedagogical goals, or is it in the way? And where it's helping, that we run with it and use it where it's appropriate. Where it's getting in the way, which is very often, it doesn't belong there, or we need, in fact, to find ways to correct the behavior. And I think it's that kind of reorientation that I'm seeing among lots of great teachers that I've been talking to since this book came out.
Thanks, John. Jenny, time-wise, we probably need to move right to the last myth.
Sure. I was just going to make a comment that I think one of the things that's really interesting about the book is that you talk not just about quality, but also about quantity of information. And I think the chapter on overload is really, really interesting and something that educators certainly need to try to grapple with. I mean, it's something I think all of us in our own lives are trying to figure out how to deal with this incredible amount of information, but it's also a particular struggle for young people, and it's something that I think, will be a challenge that we can engage in together, which is another aspect of the book that I really like, that you often talk about digital natives as having to be a really critical part of the solution. So the fourth myth, which you actually talked on a little bit earlier, was that digital natives are more prone to bullying and antisocial behavior. And you said that in your research you did find that, in fact, there is a real rise in this. Were there things that you found that debunked this myth?
So this is one of the complicated ones. It depends a lot on how you define bullying. So you have to think, of course, there's a very wide range of, clearly criminal sexual predation kind of behavior that is associated with bullying. And then there's, on the other end of the spectrum, teasing, right, and friendly interaction. And sometimes, of course, it might be sexual interaction that kids, in fact, are desiring. So there's a very big range. I think the experience that we were writing about here is one that lots of us have had. I don't think it's going on in this nicely set up chat room with 202 participants, but very often in online environments, people say things that they wouldn't say face-to-face. I think we've all had the experience of being in an email, sort of a heated email exchange, and you hit send too early. You then wish you could get it back. And in the old days of kind of local area networks, you might be able to recall a message, but now when it's gone, it's gone. There is something that psychologists talk about as the disinhibition effect, that people often are less inhibited in these digitally mediated environments than they would be if they were face-to-face with someone. And I think this is a real concern. Kids do some really aggressive things to one another, and sometimes the impact of that is extremely negative in terms of psychological impact on their colleagues. And of course, information in this environment is persistent. It's very hard to get rid of it. And it's often the case that information about somebody that is really negative floats up to the top of the Google search results and stays there for a long time. So the harm that people can cause to one another is very real, and it's very easy to do it in these online environments. I guess I find it highly unlikely that kids are actually meaner to one another today than they were, a generation ago. It's very hard to make that case one way or the other. I think one way to look at the bullying data, if you want to have a skeptical viewpoint, is to say, for the first time, bullying that used to happen in the schoolyard, which we couldn't see, now we can see in the online environment. So we can go into MySpace or Facebook or a chat environment and see it as it happens as parents and teachers. We can also see it after the fact. So the point is it's recorded, and then we can see it after it happens. So we don't have to have been there synchronously. We can see it asynchronously. So I think I don't have data on this because I don't think it exists, but I think there is a possibility that this is just the same bullying that has been going on forever. It's just all of a sudden in this online space we in fact can see it.
Great. Well then I guess my other question, which is related, is you look in the book at how this population interacts differently with information institutions and each other. So are there positive things that you found about this population and the way that they engage with each other that may be different than previous generations or previous other populations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in the context of dealing with one another, there's no doubt that there is a very vibrant online social environment that's integrated with offline social environments, and that kids are enjoying connecting with one another, and that self-expression and social life in the digital world is something that kids love. The flip side of that, of course, is if you've got a young person in your life who is then offline for a short while, for a week or so on vacation, or even for a short while, like an hour, and can't get access to their Facebook account, sometimes get very anxious because they feel disconnected from the social life. But I think in some respects that's an indication that they're having fun in that environment, and it's something that they that is attractive to them. There's a wonderful study done by a woman named Mimi Ito and her team in California called the Digital Youth Study, and I would highly encourage you to take a look at that. It really looks at the informal kinds of learning and informal interaction that youth are engaging in online, and assesses the good and the bad, but really emphasizes, I think, the positive things going on in terms of youth interaction. Great.
So I think because we are getting close to the hour that we should turn it over to participants who might have questions. I know that there's been a ton going on in the chat space and lots of reactions. Do people have specific questions they'd like to pose to John about any of these myths or other issues related to digital natives and how they use media and technology?
And while we're asking for that, I did catch one. I think I'm not alone. Many people were saying that it was very hard to follow the chat because there were so many people, and I agree. But John, one question that did come from the audience was, do the natives see older teachers as invaders?
That's a really good question. I don't think so overall, but it certainly is often a first reaction. So I take it that the question really is about if you go into an environment that's kind of a youth environment, is it is it the case that kids then immediately leave, right? There's one way to see this, which is that youth are going into environments like MySpace because the sort of offline environments that we've created for them are kind of insufficient, and so they're seeking spaces that are youth-only spaces. And I think we have to be aware that that may be going on some of the time. I'm not that keen, though, on setting up environments where it's youth-only without any structured, appropriate adult involvement, teachers, social workers, and others. So I guess I'd be concerned if that were kind of our overall reaction. But the other piece of it is, if in fact there's no way for adults to participate in the same environments, I think it's very hard for us to give constructive, common sense feedback to young people, and I think that's a key part of this equation. There was a bit on the chat that went by where one person was saying that they're worried about the gulf that's growing between adults and kids, and I think there's a real worry here. But I think that if you let young people be your guides from time to time, let them show you into these environments, more often than not, they are eager to show people. And they may show you not their profile, but their friend's profile, and they may show you something that happened to somebody else, because they may not want to personalize it. But I actually think that there is a lot of promise that young people will like to be the teachers to some extent, and obviously we have to open ourselves up to that.
John, Chris asks, what is your suggested solution to updating copyright laws?
Oh man, that's a good one. So I would go for the gold, which is a fairly dramatic thing for digital materials. I would adopt an alternative copyright system or an alternative compensation system. There's a book that my colleague at Harvard Law School, Terry Fisher, wrote, which it's called Promises to Keep, and in Chapter 6 he makes a proposal for this kind of alternative compensation system. There are two versions of it. One is a state-mandated one, another is one that would run on a cooperative basis. But the basic idea would be for music and movies in particular, what we would do is to say that the regular copyright doesn't apply, that you do have to pay. You pay either through a tax in the state-mandated approach or through broadband fees. It's probably about $5 a month. And the point would be at the end of a period, either the state or the private party would collect fees based on based on usage of music and movies, and then we would pay pro rata out to the artists for how much it was enjoyed. This would take away the problem that artists aren't getting paid for enjoyment by young people. It would also encourage an environment in which young people can remix freely and, in fact, be encouraged to learn in that way. This is a very dramatic copyright reform. There are lots of lesser ones, but we don't have time to go into all of them. This kind of approach was actually brought before the French legislature last year. There are a bunch of other countries considering it. I think it's a long time before the United States does anything this dramatic. But if I had my way and could wave a magic wand, I would go to such a different system.
John Karniak asks, is the scan and click browsing affecting students' abilities to read longer passages carefully? Is traditional text-based literacy being affected here?
This is one that I don't honestly know the answer to it. It is clearly the case that young people are less likely to read a sustained argument in the form of a book. I think most most data show this. There are some studies that show the contrary, but I guess I inclined to believe that it's the case that they are reading less in long book form. It's not the case that they won't read long format articles in magazines, from what I've seen. So I don't know that it's exactly the sort of standard ADD definition. I guess my instinct on it from the perspective of a teacher would be to say, okay, the data isn't great. We're not totally positive on what's going on here. We should encourage kids to use longer format sources. And I think, one of the things I'm eager to understand better is, why is it the case that kids will clearly watch a couple-hour movie still, right? They still will play World of Warcraft for hours and hours and hours. What is it about what's happening in those environments that sustains their attention that we might not be seeing in other ways? And is there a way to try to bring that back? So I think that's a really good question and a challenge for all of us. I think a simple way to do it, judging again from our research, was if you assign them to cite to a book and then challenge them on what they put in the paper, then at least they will be encouraged to do that, and maybe they'll end up loving it. I guess I don't inherently think that kids born at this point in history are going to enjoy books less. They certainly love J.K. Rowling, for instance.
I think that's a great example. Jenny, do we have time for one more question?
Sure,
of course.
A number of people have mentioned the use of portable devices in the classroom. John, do you have a feeling about this? As you look at your own children, have you thought about whether or not you'd want them to be able to bring in an iPhone or an iPod Touch?
That's a great question. I've never actually thought about it in that particular way. There's a lively debate in many schools about whether or not you should have internet access of any sort. So it could be a cell phone, it could be a PDA, it could be a laptop. The experience that we had at Harvard Law School was we spent, this 10 years ago, millions of dollars to rewire all of our classrooms. Really did a beautiful job of it. And then at the next faculty meeting, I was a student at the time, not a member of the faculty, the vote was taken to turn off the internet access because the faculty said, well, why do we actually want this? We wired this up, but I don't want it during the class at this point. And I think this has taken place in school after school around the country. We now have the same exact debate with Wi-Fi. We've put in all these wireless routers, and yet lots of teachers don't want wireless in the classroom at that time. And yet it's hard to keep it out because kids can use all manner of private services to get it in. My feeling generally is, again, to go back to this concept that we should ask the question first, what are our pedagogical goals? Forget the fact that technology is involved. And then say, can the technology help us achieve those goals? Is the technology something that's helping, or is it hindering this work? And my sense is in some classrooms, the technology helps enormously. It's a really cool way for young people to get access to different kinds of information. It's a really great way for kids to remake things and to learn in creative ways. And then there are instances where we really shouldn't have technology. The laptop should be down. A really clear example in the law school world is if you have a great Socratic teacher at the front of the room who basically says, somebody stand and state the facts of the case, and then you get into a debate with them in the old school way, that's a great way to teach, and technology doesn't necessarily have a place there. So I guess I would go back to, what kind of a classroom are we talking about? Is there a way that you could use the iPhone that in fact is going to, enhance the experience? And if the answer is yes, then fine, keep it in. If not, I would disallow it.
Well, I think that's a good note to wrap up on. I did want to point out that the book is actually part of a much larger project. And so in addition to the book, there is a wiki and a blog and a link to a whole bunch of videos that were created by digital natives in response to the book. So I strongly encourage you all to check out all of the links on this slide here. Again, this will be part of your recording. And learn about the larger project, and the wiki and the blogs give you a way to remain in conversation with John about these issues. I also wanted to make folks aware that Steve is going to be interviewing two of the Harvard students who worked on this project with John on Thursday, March 5th. At 8 p.m. as part of his Future of Education webinar series. So I hope that those of you who are interested in exploring these issues further and doing so from the perspective of digital natives will join Steve for that event. I wanted to let folks know that we have 3 more webinars coming up on the PBS Teachers Live and Classroom 2.0 series. Our next webinar on March 18th is called Remixing Shakespeare for 21st Century Students, and we're going to have a bunch of experts from the Folger and some really innovative teachers sharing what they're doing with students to bring Shakespeare to life in this day and age. On April 7th, we're going to have a webinar focused on Earth Day and a very popular kids program called Cyber Chase, and we're going to be looking at a whole bunch of new resources from them and talking with some math education experts about how to use technology to enhance elementary math education. And then in May, we're going to be talking with the folks from Jean-Michel Cousteau Ocean Adventures about environmental science and place-based education and how to use media and technology to enhance those. So I hope you'll join us for all of those. Just a quick plug for our site. If you're not familiar with PBS Teachers, we have thousands of free standard-based resources. So we hope that you'll go and visit us and look through the subject area pages and the media literacy resources and familiarize yourself with our collection. We work, with high quality teachers and curriculum developers to create all of these, and we distribute them to you for free. So please take advantage. I also wanted to point out that we have some very cute new activity packs, which are widgets that contain collections of PBS resources and classroom activities organized around specific themes. So one you might want to check out in March, because it's Women's History Month, is a widget focused on women's rights then and now. But we have a large collection spanning social studies, science, and other topics. So you can come to the site if you like it. You can click on the Grab It button on the lower right corner, and you can embed it right on your own web page or social networking site, which is a great way to share it with other people. We also have a social network at PBS Teachers. In our question earlier, it looked like a lot of folks said that they're members of Facebook. We hope that you'll also check out PBS Teachers Connect, which is designed for teachers to connect with each other around using media and technology to improve education. And there's a discussion set up in there right now about tonight's webinar. So if you'd like to continue the conversation, please sign in and chat in that space about what you learned tonight and about a whole slew of other issues. Of course, Steve is also the proud creator and owner of his own social network, Classroom 2.0, and we strongly encourage you to visit that and join that social network as well. And as I said earlier in the program, links to the archives from these events will be on both of our sites, so please visit us and contribute to the communities. Before we go, I can't go without thanking Illuminate for hosting the event this evening. We certainly couldn't have done it without them, and we're very, very thankful for their generous support. And now, last but not least, Steve is putting up a survey. So we would really appreciate if before you log off tonight, you could answer these questions quickly and let us know what you thought about tonight's event so that we can use this information to make each event a little bit better than the last. So thank you so much for joining us, John. It was a huge pleasure. We really, really appreciated having you here. I hope everyone had a great night.
Let's all clap for John.
Thank you so much, Jenny and Steve and everyone else.
Sorry, John, I talked over you, but thank you for being here.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thanks. Good night. Maria Elena, if you have a question, can you put it in the chat window, please? Gina, yeah, you can just quit.